It all began on the cold morning of June 29th, 1973, in a quiet hospital room. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness as a body lay motionless on the bed. The familiar laughter, the applause, the adoration, everything that had once defined this man, was now replaced by silence. The name that had once filled theaters with joy and made millions laugh now seemed like a fading echo. Outside the room, a crowd of reporters waited, eagerly anticipating the official confirmation of his death. Inside, the doctors signed the death certificate of German Valdés, better known as Tin Tan, the man who had brought laughter to an entire nation. In the room, the reality set in. No more jokes, no more spontaneous humor, and no more larger-than-life personality. His legacy was now reduced to a simple death certificate. The world, it seemed, had moved on, and yet there was a lingering question. What had happened to this man, the beloved star, the Pachuco de Oro, who had once embodied everything that was vibrant and irreverent in Mexican comedy? What had happened to the man who had made a whole country laugh? What had happened to the fame, the recognition, the golden years that followed his rise to stardom? Now, all that remained was a tragic silence, a silence filled with unfinished business and unresolved questions. Outside the hospital room, the reporters were still waiting, unaware of the deeper story that would unfold. A story of broken promises, shattered legacies, and a family left to pick up the pieces. At the heart of the story lay a single document, a will that was barely a page long, containing only a single sentence and no wealth to speak of. This would mark the beginning of a family feud that would drag on for decades. Behind the closed doors of that modest room, the inheritance, or rather the lack of it, began to tear apart the Valdés family. Lost contracts, unpaid debts, and a family legacy that seemed to have slipped through their fingers were only the beginning of their struggles. As Mexico remembered Tin Tan as the iconic Pachuco, his children slowly discovered that bearing the Valdés name was more of a curse than a blessing. It was a name that carried with it not only the weight of his fame, but also the burden of unresolved conflicts and legal battles. The stories of their father's greatness were not enough to shield them from the fallout of a life built on fame and excess. The Valdés name, once synonymous with laughter and joy, had now become a symbol of tragedy and loss. The man who had made millions laugh, now left behind a family trapped in a cycle of legal disputes and personal betrayals. The laughter that once filled the air had been replaced by the cold sound of documents being filed away, promises broken, and memories fading into the past. What had truly happened to Tin Tan's legacy? Why had the family, once surrounded by so much love and admiration, been left to struggle in the shadows of a name that should have been their inheritance? The questions linger, unanswered, as the legacy of German Valdés continues to haunt those who once carried his name. The man known as German Valdés, or as millions of Mexicans affectionately called him, Tin Tan, was once a household name. His rise to fame was swift, and his career spanned decades, earning him a place in the hearts of many. But it wasn't just his films that made him a star. It was his infectious personality, his unique charm, and his ability to connect with his audience. His portrayal of the Pachuco became a symbol of rebellion, humor, and a certain defiance against the norms of society. He was the Pachuco de Oro, the Golden Pachuco, a title that would remain attached to him for the rest of his life and beyond. But fame, as anyone who has ever experienced it knows, can be a double-edged sword. While it brought him adoration, it also brought about pressures and contradictions that would eventually lead to his downfall. The man who had once been adored by millions, who was welcomed into the homes of families across the country, found himself trapped in the very same fame that had once lifted him. The public's love for Tin Tan was unwavering, but behind the scenes, cracks were beginning to form in his personal life and his career. In the early years of his stardom, Tin Tan was on top of the world. He had a unique style, one that fused Mexican culture with American influences, and he used that to his advantage. The Pachuco persona, sharp suits, tilted hats, and street slang, became his signature. He was more than just a comedian. He was a cultural icon, someone who resonated deeply with the Mexican public. He represented the marginalized, the underdog, those who had been left behind by society. His humor was a tool of survival, a way to laugh at the hardships of life while acknowledging their existence. But that same persona, so beloved by the masses, was beginning to take a toll on him. Tintin was not without his flaws. Like many stars, he was drawn to the excesses that fame often brings: the parties, the women, the alcohol. His personal life became a reflection of his public persona: wild, carefree, and chaotic. While the public adored him, those closest to him began to see the cracks forming in the facade. His marriages were troubled, his relationships strained, and his health deteriorating. Despite his success, the internal struggle was becoming too much to bear. Yet, despite all of this, Tintin's career continued to soar. He became one of the most recognized figures in the golden age of Mexican cinema. He starred in over 100 films, recorded multiple albums, and went on tours across Latin America. His fame was unmatched, but the man behind the smile was increasingly becoming a shadow of himself. By the 1960s, the landscape of the entertainment industry had changed. The world had moved on, and with the rise of new forms of entertainment, like rock music and television, Tintin's brand of comedy began to feel outdated. The once celebrated star was now struggling to adapt to a changing world. The same industry that had once eagerly embraced him now turned its back. He was no longer the Pachuco de Oro. He was simply a relic of a bygone era. The decline in his career mirrored his personal struggles. The fame that had once seemed like an eternal flame was now flickering out. But even as his career began to falter, the public's love for Tintin remained. His films were still shown on television, and his character continued to be an iconic part of Mexican pop culture. People still remembered him as the Pachuco, as the man who had brought laughter to a nation. Yet beneath the surface, the Valdés family was in turmoil. The problem wasn't just that Tintin had become irrelevant in the eyes of the industry. It was that his family, too, had become victims of his fame. His children, those who had been born into a life of privilege, who had been raised in the shadow of their father's greatness, found themselves unable to escape it. For some, the name Valdés became a weight they could never shed. It was a name that had once symbolized greatness, but now it represented a tragic irony. The Valdés children were constantly compared to their father, but they could never live up to the legend he had become. Carlos Valdés, the eldest son, tried to follow in his father's footsteps. He worked in theater, dubbing, and television, but no matter how hard he tried, he was always overshadowed by the memory of Tintin. The public saw him as a shadow of his father, never able to match the brilliance that had made his father a star. Being Tintin's son is both a privilege and a curse, Carlos once said in an interview. You're admired by the public, but the industry treats you like a shadow. Rosalia Valdés, his daughter, fared no better. She, too, inherited her father's talent, but after his death, her career came to an abrupt halt. Tired of constantly being asked about her father, she withdrew from the entertainment industry. She spent the years following his death fighting for the rights to his films and his legacy, struggling to preserve his memory in the face of an indifferent industry. For her, the name Valdés became a reminder of what had been lost. The rest of the Valdés children, Francisco, Javier, Olga, and Gennaro, each took different paths, but none of them could escape the shadow of their father's name. Some left the public eye entirely, while others tried, unsuccessfully, to make a name for themselves in fields unrelated to entertainment. Yet, despite their best efforts, the Valdés name continued to haunt them. It was a name that had brought them nothing but pain, conflict, and an overwhelming sense of loss. As the years went by, the Valdés family became embroiled in legal battles over the rights to Tintin's films, with Televisa and other media companies profiting from his work without compensating the family. The royalties that should have gone to the family were either lost or withheld, and the legal disputes dragged on for years. The curse of the Valdés name had now transformed from a symbol of fame to a symbol of exploitation, resentment, and legal battles that could never be fully resolved. The public continued to remember Tin Tan fondly, but for his children, the legacy of his fame was more of a burden than a blessing. The Pachuco de Oro had left behind not just a cultural legacy, but a family torn apart by the very thing that had made him a star. As time passed, the Valdés family found themselves constantly reminded of the price of fame, the price that Tin Tan had paid, and the price that his children would continue to pay for years to come. The name Valdés, once associated with joy and laughter, had become a symbol of struggle, loss, and an enduring sense of tragedy. The crash was inevitable. Despite the fame, the adoration, and the accolades that had filled his life, Tin Tan's inevitable downfall came crashing down slowly but surely. It wasn't a single event, a singular moment that marked the shift from stardom to obscurity. It was the slow erosion of everything he had once held dear. The first signs were subtle, hidden behind the glimmer of his ongoing projects, the parties, the adoration of his fans. But beneath the surface, a deep fissure had already begun to grow. The man who had once been a symbol of the Mexican golden age of cinema was no longer the same, and neither was the world that had adored him. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Tin Tan's popularity reached its peak. He was the quintessential star, celebrated not only for his iconic portrayal of the Pachuco, but also for his ability to bring joy to millions. He was the golden boy of Mexican cinema, the face of a time when Mexican films ruled the Latin American box office, and his fame stretched across borders. His career had been a whirlwind. Tours across Latin America, television appearances, films that broke records at the box office, and a family that adored him. But as the world around him evolved, so too did the pressures that came with it. By the mid-1960s, the landscape of entertainment had started to shift. The rock and roll revolution, political tensions, and the increasing influence of television began to erode the place Tin Tan once held in Mexican cinema. The world had changed, and so had the taste of the audience. The same jokes, the same antics, the same beloved Pachuco character were no longer as relevant in an ever-changing cultural climate. But it wasn't just the industry that was changing, it was also Tin Tan himself. Despite the outward appearances of success, the cracks in his personal life were becoming harder to ignore. His personal battles, his struggles with alcohol, his tumultuous relationships, and his increasing sense of isolation were taking a toll. He had become a man trapped by his own fame, unable to escape the pressures of living up to the larger-than-life image that had been created for him. The man who had once been the life of the party was now often seen alone, spiraling into a darkness that only he could understand. In 1965, Tin Tan's personal and professional life collided in a devastating way. After years of living in the fast lane, his physical and mental health began to decline. The effects of his drinking, the constant pressure of his career, and his inability to adapt to the changing entertainment landscape all took their toll. His body, once the vessel of charm and vitality, was now showing the signs of wear and tear. In the early 1970s, his career hit a low point. The industry that had once embraced him was now indifferent, no longer interested in his brand of humor. The major studios turned their backs on him, and his films were relegated to late-night TV airings, their significance diminished. His financial situation was no better. The lavish lifestyle he had once enjoyed was now a distant memory, replaced by unpaid debts and financial struggles. The man who had once enjoyed the luxuries of mansions and cars was now forced to sell off his property just to stay afloat. And then came the final blow. In 1972, Tin Tan was diagnosed with cirrhosis of the liver and pancreatic cancer. The man who had once been the epitome of vitality was now a shell of his former self. His health deteriorated rapidly, and in his final days, he was barely able to walk. Yet, despite the mounting evidence that his time was running out, he refused to accept the inevitable. In his final birthday celebration, surrounded by the few friends who had remained by his side, Tin Tan toasted with water instead of alcohol. He murmured a line that would haunt his wife, Rosalia for years to come. I've spent so much time making others laugh that I've forgotten how to live. The weight of those words, spoken in the quiet of his final days, carried the realization that, for all the joy he had brought to others, he had been unable to find happiness in his own life. His death on June 29, 1973, marked the end of an era, not only for Tin Tan, but for the family that would be left to pick up the pieces. His widow, Rosalia, and their 6 children were left with a legacy of debts and unanswered questions. The inheritance he left behind was nothing more than a pile of financial chaos and broken promises. There were no hidden treasures, no secret bank accounts, no funds stashed away to secure their future. Instead, there were unpaid hospital bills, mortgages on the house, and a stack of legal documents that had been neglected for years. Despite his financial ruin, Tin Tan's legacy continued to live on in the memories of his fans. His films were still shown on television, and his iconic Pachuco character remained a symbol of Mexican culture. But for his children, the reality was far different. The family, now left to fend for themselves, was forced to navigate the legal and emotional fallout of his death. The promise of wealth and security that Tin Tan's fame had seemed to guarantee never materialized. Instead, they were left with the heavy burden of their father's name, a name that had once symbolized success but was now a reminder of everything that had been lost. As his children struggled to make sense of their father's legacy, they discovered that the name Valdés, once synonymous with laughter and joy, had now become a symbol of loss, conflict, and confusion. His son, Carlos Valdés, tried to follow in his father's footsteps, but he was constantly overshadowed by the memory of the legendary Tin Tan. The public's expectations weighed heavily on him, and despite his efforts, he could never escape the shadow of his father's greatness. For his daughter, Rosalia Valdés, the burden was even greater. After her father's death, she dedicated herself to preserving his memory and fighting for the rights to his films. But the legal battles, the financial struggles, and the constant reminders of what had been lost wore her down. Her efforts to secure the rights to her father's work were met with resistance from the media companies who had profited from Tin Tan's legacy without compensating the family. It became clear that, while the world remembered Tin Tan fondly, his family was left to struggle with the fallout. The years that followed Tin Tan's death were filled with legal battles, broken promises, and mounting resentment. The Valdés family fought to reclaim their inheritance, but they were met with roadblocks at every turn. The industry that had once celebrated Tin Tan now turned its back on his family, leaving them to pick up the pieces of a legacy that had become more curse than blessing. As the years passed, the Valdés family found themselves wrestling not only with the loss of their father, but with the haunting realities of a life defined by both fame and tragedy. For many of Tin Tan's children, the search for meaning began with trying to understand the source of their father's emotional and financial downfall. To comprehend this, they had to trace back to the roots of their family's journey, where it all began, far from the glamorous lights of cinema and celebrity. The story of German Valdés, born in 1915 in Ciudad Juarez, was not one of instant privilege or luck. His family was far from wealthy. His father was a customs officer, and his mother, a seamstress, struggled to make ends meet. In a house filled with 12 siblings, the daily struggles of survival overshadowed the possibility of fame. The young boy, German, grew up in an environment where the comfort of food was uncertain, where clothing was stitched together out of necessity, and where every day felt like a battle to find something to smile about. Yet, amidst these challenges, there was something in him that set him apart. He had a gift, one that would shape his future and the future of his children. From a young age, he mimicked the world around him. The street vendors, the priests, the soldiers, anyone he could see, anyone who walked past his modest home in the harsh desert landscape of Ciudad Juarez. He possessed a rare ability to turn hardship into laughter, to bring joy where there seemed to be none. While other children around him may have been consumed by the bitter taste of poverty, German was developing a skill that would one day carry him to international fame. At just 10 years old, German was already making people laugh. And it was this gift, this ability to find humor in the bleakest circumstances, that would one day earn him the name Tin Tan. But despite this early talent, the path was not without its obstacles. The family moved to Mexico City in 1925, hoping for a better life. However, the hardships continued. Young German took up several odd jobs: delivery boy, bootblack, and even a radio announcer at the local station, XW. He wasn't content just to make a living. He wanted to escape the poverty that clung to his every step. And in 1935, after years of struggling, he found his break: a radio program where he created the Pachuco character. Half Mexican, half American, a rebellious street figure with a sharp wit and a heart of gold. The public's reaction to the Pachuco was immediate and overwhelming. This was a character they could relate to, a symbol of both pride and defiance. But behind this carefully constructed image was a man struggling to find his place in a rapidly changing world. The Pachuco, with his oversized suits, tilted hat, and slang-riddled speech, was not just a character. It was a persona that allowed Tin Tan to escape the limitations of his real-life circumstances. But even as he found fame, he was increasingly drawn into a personal battle, one that few could see. As his career flourished throughout the 1940s and into the 1950s, Tin Tan became a household name. He starred in over 100 films, produced albums, and performed tours across Latin America. Yet, as his star rose, his personal life became more and more complex. His marriages were troubled, and he became a man torn between the demands of his public image and the emptiness he felt in his private life. The woman he married, Michaela Vargas, was a strong, rebellious figure who helped him navigate his increasingly chaotic existence. But the strains of his fame and excesses soon began to take their toll on their relationship. They had 3 children together, but even as he fathered a family, his heart and mind were increasingly elsewhere. In 1955, Michaela left him, exhausted by the endless cycles of emotional neglect and turmoil. By then, Tin Tan had become a man who could entertain millions but could not seem to find peace within himself. His reliance on alcohol and his increasing sense of loneliness compounded his issues. His family was fractured, and the relationships that had once seemed so promising were now lost to the passage of time. He would later meet Rosalia Julian, and though their relationship would bring him solace for a time, it could not shield him from the larger issues at play in his life. Tin Tan's financial troubles became more pronounced as the 1960s wore on. His fame began to fade, and with it came a loss of work. The world had changed, and the taste of the audience shifted. What had once been fresh and rebellious had become outdated, and the new wave of cinema and entertainment left Tin Tan behind. He was no longer the star he once was, and his financial mismanagement compounded the issue. His lavish lifestyle, once a symbol of success, had now turned into a liability. The man who had once commanded high fees for his films was now forced to sell his homes, his cars, and his personal belongings just to keep up with mounting debts. In 1969, after losing the house in San Angel, he found himself arrested briefly for unpaid debts. It was a public embarrassment for a man who had once been one of Mexico's greatest stars. Even as the world seemed to turn its back on him, Tin Tan, in his signature spirit, tried to soldier on. But by 1972, his health was deteriorating rapidly. A diagnosis of cirrhosis of the liver and pancreatic cancer confirmed what had been feared for some time. His once vibrant life had dwindled to a shadow of its former self. But as Tin Tan lay in the hospital, the truth was clear. His health, much like his wealth, had been squandered over time. His final years were marked by quiet resignation. He was aware that he had let the best parts of his life slip away, but he couldn't seem to find the strength to stop the decline. In his final birthday, he raised a glass of water, not wine, and muttered words that would stick with his family forever. "I spent my life making others laugh, and I forgot how to live." Those words, spoken in a moment of clarity, summed up the tragedy of his life. A man who had once been a symbol of joy and laughter had, by the end, become a mere shadow of that persona. The legacy he left behind was not one of financial wealth, but of emotional and financial chaos. The inheritance that he had intended for his children was not the fortune they had expected, but a tangled mess of debt, legal battles, and disappointment. His family, like his career, was left to struggle, each member forced to carry the weight of a name that had once been a mark of distinction but had become a burden too heavy to bear. The aftermath of German Valdés' death was not just the loss of a man. It was the beginning of a slow, unrelenting descent into a series of financial and personal struggles that would plague his family for decades to come. His children, born into the glow of their father's stardom, were now left to contend with the reality of the debts and broken promises he had left behind. The fame, the legacy, the laughter that had once filled their home were now just distant echoes, an unfulfilled promise that none of them would ever truly receive. While the world remembered Tin Tan as the Pachuco de Oro, his children were left to pick up the pieces of a family legacy that had crumbled beneath the weight of unrealized dreams and unfulfilled potential. For many, the years following their father's death were marked by a series of failed attempts to restore what had been lost, and the name Valdés became synonymous with not just fame, but the sting of failure. The reality of their inheritance, or lack thereof, became a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong and everything they had failed to protect. The first wave of disappointment came quickly. Despite the public's fondness for Tin Tan, his family soon realized that the inheritance left to them was far from what they had expected. There were no hidden treasures, no vast fortune to be found, only a house full of debts, unpaid hospital bills, and a collection of legal documents that spoke of contracts lost, royalties withheld, and broken agreements. The real tragedy was not in the financial ruin they found themselves in, but in the emotional toll it took on them. Their father, a man who had once been the embodiment of joy and laughter, had died without securing the future of his family. He had given so much to the public, his humor, his charm, his charisma, but when it came to the business of preserving his legacy, he had left his children with nothing but a name. And that name, once a symbol of pride, had now become a source of shame. Carlos Valdés, Tin Tan's eldest son, was one of the first to try and step into his father's shoes. He had the talent, the drive, and the ambition to continue the work his father had begun. Yet, despite his efforts, he found himself constantly overshadowed by the memory of Tin Tan. The public, though still fond of the Pachuco de Oro, had no interest in the new generation. Carlos found himself caught in a no-man's land, unable to escape the comparisons to his legendary father. The industry, once eager to embrace him, now turned its back, unwilling to offer him the opportunities he so desperately sought. Being Tin Tan's son is both a privilege and a curse, Carlos once admitted. You're adored by the public, but the industry treats you like a shadow. The weight of his father's fame became a burden he could never shake off, and despite his best efforts, Carlos was unable to carve out his own identity. Instead, he became a footnote in the legacy of a man whose name was far too large to be shared. For his sister, Rosalia Valdés, the path was no easier. After Tin Tan's death, she became the de facto spokesperson for the Valdés family, the one who carried the torch of his memory. Rosalia fought tirelessly for the rights to her father's films and legacy. She was determined to protect the memory of the man who had brought so much joy to the world, but the world, it seemed, had moved on. The industry that had once embraced Tin Tan now ignored his family, and the legal battles over his films proved to be an uphill struggle. Televisa, the media giant that had once profited from Tin Tan's work, now withheld the royalties that rightfully belonged to his children. Rosalia, with her unyielding spirit, filed lawsuits, fought for recognition, but the legal system and the entertainment industry were indifferent to her struggle. The years of legal battles and financial strain took their toll on her. Despite winning some battles in court, the money from the lawsuits was never enough to restore the family's fortunes. The Valdés family was trapped in a cycle of financial instability, fighting for a legacy that seemed to slip further and further away. The emotional toll of this struggle was perhaps even more damaging than the financial one. Rosalia and her siblings, though united in their desire to protect their father's memory, were also torn apart by the weight of their inheritance. Their family, once so close-knit, became fractured by the stress of legal disputes, the pressure of living up to their father's name, and the bitter resentment that slowly seeped in. The relationships that had once been built on love and shared history now felt strained and tenuous. Tin Tan's children were not alone in their struggles. The industry that had once celebrated their father now seemed to mock their attempts to keep his legacy alive. Televisa continued to air his films, but without proper compensation to the family. His films were no longer seen as valuable commodities. They had become part of the cultural landscape, relics of a bygone era, to be exploited for nostalgia's sake. The Valdés family's efforts to reclaim their inheritance were often met with resistance, and the feeling of being forgotten, of being ignored by the very industry that had once celebrated their father, became a constant ache. In the midst of this struggle, the Valdés family found themselves trying to preserve not just their father's memory, but also their own dignity. They had inherited the name Valdés, but the legacy they were left with was a broken one. The name that had once been a source of pride now felt like a burden they could never escape. The Valdés children, each of them dealing with their own personal struggles, tried to keep going, but they were haunted by the ghost of the man who had given them everything and nothing at all. Despite their best efforts, the Valdés family could not escape the consequences of their father's choices. The legacy of Tin Tan, once a symbol of joy and pride, had been marred by legal battles, financial instability, and a sense of abandonment. The curse of the Valdés name was not a supernatural one. It was the curse of fame, of a world that had once adored them, but had now turned its back. And for the Valdés children, the greatest tragedy of all was that, despite their father's brilliance, they had inherited not his fortune, but his struggles. The years that followed Tin Tan's death were marked by a slow, inevitable confrontation with reality. Despite their best efforts to preserve the memory of their father, the Valdés family found themselves facing a series of events that forced them to confront the painful truths they had long avoided. While the world continued to revere Tin Tan, to celebrate his legacy, the Valdés children were left to wrestle with the consequences of their inheritance. The name they had inherited was no longer a symbol of pride. It had become a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Rosalia, the eldest daughter, was the first to recognize that their struggles could no longer be ignored. In the years following her father's death, she had dedicated herself to preserving his memory, to fighting for his films and the rights to his image. She had spent countless hours in courtrooms, battling against media companies, struggling to secure the royalties that should have rightfully belonged to the family. But despite her tireless efforts, the reality was clear. The world had moved on. The films of Tin Tan, once the pride of Mexican cinema, were now little more than relics of the past. In 1969, after a prolonged battle, Rosalia and the rest of the Valdés children had received a glimmer of hope when they managed to secure partial rights to their father's work. But the legal victory was bittersweet. The compensation they received was paltry, barely enough to cover the mounting debts that had accumulated in the years since Tin Tan's passing. The royalties that should have been coming in from the reruns of his films and television specials were either being withheld or mismanaged. Even the restoration of his films, a long overdue project, had become a point of contention, with the rights to some of his most beloved works still tied up in red tape. The growing realization that their efforts were in vain began to take its toll on the family. For Rosalia, the emotional exhaustion became too much to bear. She had spent years fighting to protect her father's legacy, but it seemed like no matter how hard she tried, the world refused to acknowledge the injustice her family had suffered. The bitterness of the situation started to eat away at her, and she began to question whether it was worth it. The toll on the other children was equally profound. Carlos Valdés, Tin Tan's eldest son, had once dreamed of continuing his father's legacy in the entertainment world, but as the years passed, he found himself fighting a losing battle. His efforts to establish himself as an actor and comedian were constantly overshadowed by the memory of his father's larger-than-life presence. The comparisons, the expectations, none of them had been kind to him. He had tried to carve out a career for himself, but every step forward felt like 2 steps back. Carlos had spent his whole life in the shadow of Tin Tan, and despite his talent, he could never escape it. The rest of the family, too, found themselves struggling to cope with the weight of their father's name. Francisco, Javier, Olga, and Gennaro, all of them carried their own burdens. While some tried to distance themselves from the limelight, others continued to search for ways to bring recognition to their father's work. But none of them could ever escape the shadow of the man who had been both their greatest inspiration and their greatest tragedy. The turning point came in 1972, when a critical event occurred that forced the Valdés family to face their reality in a way they never had before. It wasn't a public scandal or a major legal battle, but rather a moment of personal clarity. Rosalia had been tirelessly fighting for years, but after her father's last film rights were sold to Televisa, she found herself in an unexpected legal battle with the media giant. While it was not uncommon for artists' families to fight for their share of profits, the Valdés family's case was different. This was not just a financial dispute, but a battle over their father's legacy. In an attempt to preserve his image, Rosalia began gathering records, interviews, and rare footage from their family archives, including items that Tin Tan had kept in his personal collection. It was during this time that Rosalia realized how much had been lost in the process. Her father's films, his voice, his memory, these were all being swept under the rug, forgotten by a world that had moved on. The value of his work was being eroded, and in many ways, so was the value of their family history. This painful realization was what ultimately pushed Rosalia to the brink. Her father's legacy, once a source of pride, had become a symbol of exploitation and neglect. The legal battles had drained her, both financially and emotionally, and she began to see the full extent of the damage that fame had done to her family. Their attempts to reclaim their inheritance, to restore their father's honor, were met with indifference from the industry, and the financial strain grew ever greater. It was not just the media companies that had failed the Valdés family. It was the system, the industry, and the public that had once adored their father. They had all abandoned the Valdés children, leaving them to fend for themselves in a world that no longer cared about the man who had once made millions laugh. The Valdés name, once a symbol of joy, had become a reminder of how quickly fame could turn into a burden, how easily a legacy could be lost in the shuffle of time. By the 1980s, the final blow had been dealt. The Valdés family's last attempt to reclaim their father's work through the courts had failed. While they had won some battles, the victory was hollow. The money they had hoped for never materialized, and their father's legacy remained locked away in the vaults of the media companies that had taken it from them. In the end, Rosalia and her siblings were left with only memories. Memories of a father who had given everything to the public, but had nothing left for them. The legacy of Tin Tan, it seemed, was no longer his to control. The haunting reality of this loss was felt most deeply by Rosalia. She had spent her life trying to protect her father's legacy, but in the end, it was the system that had robbed her of her father's true inheritance, the recognition and respect he deserved. His films, his voice, and his memory had been commodified, stripped of their value, and his family was left to carry the weight of a name that had once meant so much. But despite the loss, Rosalia found a sense of peace in the quiet moments of reflection. The legacy of Tin Tan may have been lost in the courts, in the contracts, and in the countless legal battles, but it lived on in the hearts of those who remembered the man behind the character, the man who had made them laugh, who had brought joy into their lives, and who, despite everything, had never lost his dignity. As the years continued to pass, the Valdés family found themselves not just fighting for their father's legacy, but grappling with the harsh realities of their own lives. The battles they had waged in the courtrooms had done little to alleviate the weight of their struggles. Despite the brief flickers of hope that appeared after legal victories or public recognition, the true essence of their father's memory remained out of reach. His name, once a powerful symbol of joy, pride, and cultural identity, had become a heavy burden. For Rosalia, the journey was particularly painful. As the last voice keeping the memory of Tin Tan alive, she had carried the burden of ensuring that his legacy was preserved. She had been the one to fight for the legal rights to his films, the one to advocate for his image, and the one to speak about him when no one else would. Yet, despite all of her efforts, the recognition and respect she had so desperately sought for her father were never fully realized. The frustration of having to constantly battle for what should have been rightfully hers, for what should have been rightfully their family's, wore down her spirit. Her father's legacy, once a beacon of pride and success, had been reduced to a constant reminder of what could have been. She had been working tirelessly to protect his image and preserve his films, but as the years went by, the industry that once celebrated Tin Tan had forgotten him. The network that had once profited from his image, his work, had moved on, and with them, so did the respect for his memory. For Rosalia, it was not just about money. It was about recognition. It was about the acknowledgement of her father's place in the cultural history of Mexico. The constant legal battles had drained her, and as much as she fought, it seemed like the world had already moved on from Tin Tan, leaving her behind with a pile of old documents, legal files, and fading memories. Despite the hardships, Rosalia found herself coming to a hard-earned realization. In the years following her father's death, she had expected the world to treat his legacy with the respect it deserved. She had wanted the fame, the recognition, and, perhaps most importantly, the love that her father had given to the public to be returned to her family. She had dreamed of a museum in his honor, a place where his films and his story could be celebrated for generations to come. But as the years stretched on, that dream never materialized. The industry, the public, and the media had moved on. The Valdés children, now grown adults, had learned that their father's legacy was no longer theirs to hold. It had been claimed by the media companies, the public, and time itself. Their own place in the story of Tin Tan was unclear. Were they mere footnotes in his history, forever overshadowed by his fame? Or were they the true keepers of his memory, those who had to live with the consequences of being the children of a legend? As Rosalia reflected on her father's life, she came to understand that the legacy of Tin Tan was not in the money or the recognition that had eluded them. It was in the love that he had given, in the laughter he had sparked, and in the joy he had shared with the world. That, she realized, was the true inheritance he had left behind. It was not something that could be stolen or lost in legal battles. It was something that lived in the hearts of those who had seen his films, who had laughed at his jokes, who had been touched by his presence. But even that, she knew, was a complicated gift. For the children of Tin Tan, their inheritance was not the wealth or fame that had once defined their father. It was something far more complex, a legacy built on both pride and pain. The laughter that their father had shared with millions had come at a price, and that price was something that none of them could escape. The weight of that laughter, the responsibility of carrying that name, was something that had haunted them for years. In her final years of reflection, Rosalia realized that the fight for recognition and respect would never truly end. The world would always remember her father, but it would do so in its own way, by playing his films, by quoting his lines, by wearing his image on T-shirts. But that recognition would always be distant, always superficial. The world would never fully understand the cost of that fame, the price that the Valdés family had paid. Yet, there was a quiet satisfaction in Rosalia's heart as she came to terms with the reality of their situation. She had spent decades fighting for her father's legacy, but in the end, she understood that the true measure of a legacy was not in the accolades or the fame, but in the impact left on the world. Her father's work had made millions laugh, had brought joy to generations of Mexicans, and that was something that could never be taken away. His films would continue to be watched, his jokes would continue to be quoted, and his spirit would live on in the laughter of the people who remembered him. As Rosalia stood at her father's grave, reflecting on the long journey she had taken to protect his memory, she realized that the greatest gift her father had left her was not a fortune, but the ability to appreciate the value of life itself. The laughter, the joy, the memories, they were all that remained, and that was enough. The rest, whether it was money, fame, or recognition, had never truly mattered. The journey of Tin Tan's legacy does not end with fame, wealth, or even the stories told about him in interviews and documentaries. It ends in the quiet spaces, where his name echoes in the memories of those who knew him and loved him, long after the applause has died down. Rosalia Valdés, the last guardian of his memory, understood this profound truth as she looked at the world that had once adored her father but had never truly understood him. Years after the legal battles, after the debts had been settled, and after the public had moved on to the next idol, the family of Tin Tan found themselves at a crossroads. The laughter that had filled their home, the joy of being in the presence of the Pachuco de Oro, had long faded, replaced by the sobering reality of their own struggles. Yet, there was a strange kind of peace in the final days, a quiet acceptance that some legacies are not meant to be fully claimed or understood. Sometimes, they are meant to be carried forward in the way people laugh, in the way they remember, and in the way they continue to share those memories with others. For Rosalia, the question that lingered was not how much recognition Tin Tan deserved, but how much of his true self had been lost to time. The world knew him as the icon, the figure who made Mexico laugh in times of need, the symbol of Mexican resilience in the face of adversity. But behind that persona was a man who had been complicated, flawed, and human, a man who had given everything to the world but had little left for himself or his family. And that, Rosalia knew, was the true cost of fame. The world would always remember the Pachuco de Oro, but the Real Tin Tan, the one who had struggled, who had loved and lost, would remain a mystery, his true legacy hidden behind the laughter. Her reflections were not an invitation for pity, nor were they an effort to rewrite history. They were simply the words of a daughter who had lived through the highs and lows of being part of a legend. As the years passed, she accepted that her father's legacy could never be fully understood by the outside world. Perhaps the greatest irony of it all was that while Tin Tan had been a symbol of joy for millions, his family had been left with the quiet, painful task of living out the rest of their lives in his shadow, struggling to understand what it meant to carry the weight of his name. There would be no grand resolutions, no final redemption, and no sweeping conclusions to this story. The legacy of Tin Tan, the Pachuco de Oro, was a complicated one, a mix of laughter and sorrow, of brilliance and brokenness. It would live on, not in grand monuments or accolades, but in the quiet moments where his memory lived on in those who still remembered him fondly, even as the world moved on to its next hero. And for Rosalia and her family, that was enough. It was the only thing that remained. As she walked away from her father's grave, Rosalia looked up at the sky and whispered, "You left us with nothing, but you also left us with everything." The rest, she knew, was simply noise, a world that would never truly understand the depth of what they had lost.